Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I want to thank everyone in attendance this evening, community members, staff, students, faculty of SLU, but also folks joining us from other institutions. So tonight's event is also being launched through the Urban Academy, which is a partnership between SLU and community colleges like BMCC, LaGuardia, and Gutman Community College that offers students a seamless transfer process from community college into SLU, as well as various forms of professional and academic programming, such as tonight's event. And so to that end, I really want to thank SLU and all the members of the public engagement team for organizing and facilitating this event tonight and bringing attention to this very current and very critical struggle around public housing and privatization in New York City. So as we heard, I'm Professor James Rodriguez, and I'm really deeply honored to have the opportunity to introduce and be in conversation with our panelists this evening. First up is Marquise Jenkins, a longtime public housing resident, organizer, and founding member of the resident-led group, Residents to Preserve Public Housing. We also welcome Aitza Torres, a longtime public housing resident, tenant association president, and member of NYCHA's citywide council of presidents. And Joshua Barnett, a longtime NYCHA architect and DC 37 member, as well as a contributor to the architecture lobby and its Green New Deal working group. So I feel especially grateful to be moderating this event tonight because each of our panelists are folks that I've been working with or learning from some degree over many years in this case. I also feel like I need to mention that the Lower East Side is really well represented on our panel this evening. Both myself, Marquise, and Aitza all hail from the Lower East Side and have deep roots in public housing on the Lower East Side, which is in many ways pretty fitting because the Lower East Side is the birthplace of public housing in New York City and in many ways in the country, with first houses built in 1935 still standing today. And so before we open a broader discussion with our speakers, I want to provide some brief context for what we mean when we're referring to public housing and the New York City Housing Authority, or NYCHA as we'll refer to it, and also what we mean when we're talking about privatization, especially in the public housing context. So NYCHA is the city agency that runs the city's public housing program, which is dedicated to providing affordable housing specifically for low income and moderate income New Yorkers. And with rental rates are set at 30% of a household's income, NYCHA in many ways is one of the few providers of truly affordable housing that still exists in New York City. NYCHA has been the nation's largest public housing agency or housing authority since it was created in 1935. But it also is still today the city's largest landlord. So there's nearly 500,000 residents out of the city's 9 million or about that call NYCHA home. And that spans nearly 200,000 apartments across more than 300 different communities throughout the 5 boroughs. NYCHA also has a less than 2% vacancy rate across its housing citywide and over 250,000 New Yorkers currently on its wait list right now. But despite the really critical need and demand for public housing in New York City, NYCHA has been steadily disinvested in at every level of government for decades now. And that has led to a combined budget and infrastructure crisis in public housing, where the agency needs a currently estimated about $40 billion to bring its homes and communities into a state of good repair. And for residents, that means folks are living with substandard living and housing conditions like lacking heat, lacking hot water, subpar maintenance and repairs, and even public health threats like mold, lead paint, among others. So that crisis in many ways has set the stage for what I'm referring to and what we'll discuss as a range of privatization efforts that have been offered by various levels of government as a solution to these problems. And by privatization efforts, I refer to really a range of strategies, and we'll dig into them more specifically as we move into our panel discussion, but a range of strategies that work generally to reduce or remove public ownership, public administration, public management, reduce or remove public budgets, and actual publicly held land from the public sector through NYCHA and shift them towards private stakeholders. But as we'll discuss, while these strategies have been pitched as a remedy to these budget and infrastructure crises, I think what we'll find is that at best, they don't necessarily or fully address the fundamental problems at NYCHA. And at worst, in many ways, are introducing a host of other issues for residents. And in some ways, even larger, potentially endangering the future of public housing as an institution and even as an idea altogether. For tonight, we'll primarily be focusing on New York City, but it's also worth noting that this context is not unique to New York and is in fact taken hold in housing authorities across the country, from places like San Francisco, Baltimore, Minneapolis, and Chicago, and even globally in places like the UK. And so with that, I really want to turn to the panelists and for everyone ask, how have you entered into doing public housing activism? So can you describe your entry into doing public housing related organizing or activism? What motivated you to take that action? What your experience have been as a part of this movement, and if and how that has changed over time?
Good evening. My name is Aixa Torres. I started when I became TA president 12 years ago, but prior to that, I actually had been active, but in 2010, when my ceiling was coming down on top of my head, but not only my ceiling, but the ceiling of several residents, we decided we were going to organize and let all the residents know, right, that there's a resident association who makes decisions for the residents in public housing, in our developments, and that wasn't known. So we literally knocked on 1,936 doors to let them know that there was going to be an election. Yes, we won the election, and with that, we proceeded to try to make things better. And in the process of that, we ended up going to court and doing an HPD court case. And ultimately 500 residents joined out of, 1,936. We won the case when everybody thought we wouldn't win the case. I have to thank the leadership of my late chairperson for my grievance committee, who documented alongside our legal department, and we went to court. And so there began my advocacy. And when I met Marquise, when I met you, James, right? And it was real important for me to make sure that the residents knew what we were doing. And people, because Bloomberg was the mayor at the time, people kept on saying, oh, he has $26 billion. And I was like, whatever. He's not God, and we're going to proceed. And I have to say, the day we went to court, the residents showed up in wheelchairs with walkers, walking straight, whatever they needed to, they were there. There was standing room only, inside the courtroom and outside the courtroom. At one point, they didn't let residents in. And so that's how we began our struggle in Smith houses, and to stand with other developments and letting other leaders know that, yes, you can push back. It's not what NYCHA says, which is what has been happening and continues to happen in a lot of the developments.
Thanks so much, Aixa, and we'll return momentarily to some of your more specific experience doing some of that organizing and as a TA president. And just real quick for folks that aren't familiar with NYCHA, Aixa is reporting live right now from the Smith Houses Community Center room. If you are a public housing veteran, you may have recognized that background, but for folks that aren't, and as we heard from Aixa, this work is ongoing and it's very, very current, and folks are quite literally in the middle of it right now. So let's hear some more. I see Marquise is unmuted.
Yes, good evening, everyone. It's great to see you. And what brought me into public housing is I grew up in public housing with my 9 siblings and my mom and my dad. And there was no other place we can live that would house all 10 of my mom and dad's children and my nieces and nephews. So I come from a very big family. But what got me involved with organizing is pushing for a community center. I started off very young working at an after-school program, Middle Collegiate Church, and saw how valuable the after-school program was to the development of young people in my community, hearing the kids talk about what they wanted to do when they grow up, doctors, lawyers, and the like, and then coming to my community and hearing the kids spend more time talking about the latest pair of Michael Jordan sneakers that they wanted. There were no tools or mechanisms that would allow them to see past the 3-block radius of their neighborhood. And so I wanted to recreate that after-school program at the public housing development where I grew up at Mariana Bracetti on Lower East Side on East 4th Street. And so in my pursuit, I ran for Tenant Association president. And in my struggle to become the TA president, I came across good old Lower East Side. And good old Lower East Side trained me and turned me into the organizer I am today. And so for 16 years, I've been organizing with public housing residents here in the city, but all across the country as well.
Amazing, Marquise, thank you. And so again, we'll get more into some of your specific experience and that very long, over decade-long experience that each of you, Marquise and Aitza, have. But I also want to turn it over to Joshua Barnett. And before we even hear from him, spotlight the ways that we have a lot of resident-led activism and organizing in public housing, but it's not actually limited to just folks that are residents. And so with that, I'll turn to Joshua so that he can tell us about his experience around public housing organizing and activism.
Okay, hi, like I said, I'm Josh Barnett. I'm an architect at the New York City Housing Authority. I'm a union rep in Local 375, DC 37. We have a union coalition that I co-chair. And unlike Aisha and Marquise, we're really on the front lines. I didn't grow up in public housing, but I did grow up in Crown Heights in Brooklyn when it was still a working class. Yeah, I'm saying, yeah, I'm outnumbered by the Lower East Side here. When it still was a working class neighborhood, and like my father was a printer, and like everybody else, we dreaded the landlord's knock on the door the first of the month. That was something that permeated the neighborhood. It just, comes back to what working class people deal through because housing is a commodity, and I was lucky enough to be able to force my family to go to architecture school. But, and then I worked for the Boston Housing Authority, which was one of the only nonprofit jobs I could get. And it was also at the time when I was living in Massachusetts, I'm from Brooklyn, where there was a big fight to save rent control in Massachusetts. And the real estate industry really hammered it. They actually wound up abolishing rent control again to maximize profits as real estate became really an incredibly even more valuable commodity. By the way, I was fired from the Boston Housing Authority for union organizing. That kind of thing still happens. But I did get a job with NYCHA. And what really got me into the activism part was not only as a union rep, 3rd generation union, but seeing that there's an unfortunate divide a lot of the time. Like you said, there are a lot of groups that are fighting around housing, but the housing movement can also be very siloed. Unfortunately, you have people fighting for rental housing, people fighting for public housing, people fighting against mortgage evictions. Then you have the workers, and you would think that there would be a natural, unity. Your landlord is my boss, but they tend to, find along parallel paths. And so I really try to, and we've been trying with the NYCHA Coalition to try and get some unity, both between the unions at the Housing Authority and between the workers, NYCHA public housing workers and public housing residents, and the community, because it doesn't just affect the people who live in public housing. As you said, this is the last stock of affordable housing. If it goes down, it's taking all of us with it. So that's how it came from.
Thanks so much, Josh. And those are really terrific comments. And I definitely want to return more to some of your experience around that and just spotlight, as you mentioned, the way that sometimes the housing movement can be siloed, but also the housing and the labor movements can be siloed or feel like they're, as you said, moving in parallel tracks. And so I'm especially glad to have you on our panel tonight because I feel like the work and the activism that you do really represent a model for how that doesn't actually have to be the case. So we'll definitely return to that this evening as well. So we've been alluding to it, to privatization, to the role of real estate in public housing, but I think this is a good moment for us to dig into some specifics around the current privatization efforts that are ongoing in New York City and in the New York City Housing Authority. So two of the biggest privatization policies now in place at NYCHA are the Permanent Affordability Commitment Together, otherwise known as PACT, and the Public Housing Preservation Trust, otherwise known as the Trust. For anyone that's unfamiliar with these efforts, you might think that these sound like good ideas. Permanent affordability, public housing preservation. These sound like ideas that residents and housing organizers would be in support of. But in fact, just the opposite has been true. So I want to pose to the panel, why have residents and activists organized in opposition to these plans? Or maybe put another way, what are the impacts or consequences of these privatization plans on residents and public housing as an institution?
So I'll kick us started. One of the programs that you mentioned is PAC, Permanent Affordability Commitment Together. And as you stated, it sounds like a very positive initiative. But what PAC essentially does is it takes public housing developments and put them into the hands of private developers to manage and operate these units. And in doing so, we are fearful of losing our rights and protections that come under the federal rules that are called the 964 Rules and Regulations, which governs residents' rights to actually be a part of the decision-making of every aspect as it relates to public housing. It is the right to organize. It is the right to have space to organize, and it's the right to have funding to support those organizing efforts. And it is also the fight to make sure that when there is construction work or any dollars that's coming from HUD, making sure that we're creating job opportunities for public housing residents, that we're creating home ownership opportunities for public housing residents. And we lose all of those things when we cross over from Section 9 public housing to Section 8 under private management. The other thing that we are fearful of is borrowing money for public housing. As our government on all three levels decide to defund public housing, not give it the adequate funding, our housing authority, just like many housing authorities across the country, have decided to borrow money. And what we are fearful of is if we are not getting the funding, the direct funding that we need from our government, and that we have to borrow money, how can we be ensured that the money that we currently have will be enough funding to pay back any debt? And what are the consequences if we cannot afford to pay back the debt that is generated through these private management programs?
Thanks so much, Marquise. I mean, there's some things I want to add to, but I want to see if either Aita or Joshua want to chime in before I try to make some connections there around both of those proposed programs that Marquise described.
Okay, I'll chime in. Under the 964, as Marquise said, the residents are supposed to be included from the moment of conception. We have not been included in the process. Has been handling this by telling you've been selected for this program or that program. And that's the end of it. And unless residents push back and really organize, they usually end up going under a private developer, and the residents are then left in limbo because NYCHA is no longer responsible. And then you get irresponsible management. And so they don't have any say, they have no rights. And the 964 no longer protects them. And that is the crux of why we have been pushing back. Section 9 is for the residents with rights, allow us to organize, but also allow us to grow as a community and create stability for the residents in public housing. Whereas Section 8 is really like welfare for the public sector. I'm stealing the words of one of my colleagues on CCOP, where we talk about Section 8, but the reality of it is it's candies for private developers, and the ones who lose are the residents. Thank you.
Joshua, did you want to? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, just, I mean, just really quick, because I can't add anything to what Aisha Mark says about, Section 9 and Section 8 privatizing NYCHA. I would just take, from the union point of view, take a step back and say that, they're not reinventing the wheel here. Privatization has a long history, and it's not just housing. If we look at whatever, when you privatize any public service, transportation, education, the museums, the libraries, the parks, the prisons have horror stories, literally horror stories from privatizing. And it just really, it just caters to the whole myth that the private sector can do things more efficiently when they're just about the bottom line. And what they're really playing on, I think, is the whole idea in this country that there are certain services like public education we accept as basically public, but public housing has always been, they've always portrayed as a bitter pill to swallow. Housing is supposed to be a profit generating commodity, and public housing really proves the lie to that. So I think they're trying to obliterate the last of it. And so from the union point of view, we have a long history of knowing what privatization does to a stable workforce, does to resident hiring, does to a civil service workforce. And so we're opposing it on that basis. And also just, we also know how much outsourcing goes on at NYCHA, how much they're hiring high-paid consultants who cost twice or three times what it would take a resident or a worker to do, because they don't really care about the bottom line. They just want to make sure they're not beholden to people to provide shelter. So from the union point of view, we're really, really apprehensive of where this is going and where it can go.
Thanks so much, Joshua. And so I think with what we heard from each of our panelists is, I think both a really specific breakdown of, in particular, two specific policies, again, PACT, which is the Permanent Affordability Commitment Together, and then the Public Housing Preservation Trust. And so together, these are separate policies that are both working to privatize. And one thing I want to emphasize before we move on is that these efforts are not being described as privatization from the housing authority or from the city. That's language that generally has come from organizers, residents, and activists. And one of those reasons is because of, in some ways, bureaucratic technicalities, right? So we heard Aitza and Marquise talking about the differences between Section 8 and Section 9. And folks may be familiar with Section 8 as a housing voucher program. And so as Aitza was getting at, Section 8 also runs through HUD, the Department of the Urban Development at the federal level, or Housing and Urban Development. And it's also administered through NYCHA on the local level. So in that way, there are some ways that folks think about Section 8 as part of the public housing program. It's run through the same agencies. It runs through the same federal agencies as well. But as Aitza was highlighting, Section 8 is primarily a voucher program. And so what happens through Section 8 is that a local housing authority like NYCHA will use funds to subsidize the market rent in a private developer or landlord's housing. So that housing subsidy is going to developers and landlords, which is a very different model, as we are hearing from Joshua, than Section 9, which is true public housing, which is the conventional public housing stock of NYCHA that exists still across the 5 boroughs in New York City, where it is an entirely publicly owned and publicly subsidized housing provider that is capping rents at 30%. And that money is from public budgets and federal budgets into a public housing authority. So what's been happening across both of these PACT and public housing trust programs are ways that Section 9 housing is being eroded, in part through conversions into Section 8 housing. And in many ways, that leads to some of the distinction that we have with language. And so again, if you go to the housing authority, they will claim, and in some ways technically be accurate, that this is not a privatization plan, and it will still be through a public housing program. But as Joshua alluded to, and Aitza as well, through PACT and the trust, and through moving to Section 8, it allows private developers to get a really deep foothold into what has previously been publicly owned land, publicly owned, managed, and administered housing, and also, as Marquise got at, public funding. And so through the trust, or the newly passed trust, the housing authority is now emboldened to take on debt to sort of satisfy its repairs. And given existing concerns around budgets and the legislation, which is going to prioritize creditors for revenue before resident repairs, it's become a huge, huge sticking point for residents who, yes, are in need of repairs and support, but see a path towards public funding of budgets rather than turning solely to the private sector in the way Joshua described, as feeling like the private sector is the only mechanism to provide a actual service. So those are a few of the really main pieces. And the last thing I'll say before moving on is that the Public Housing Preservation Trust is quite new. It really just passed legislation this summer, despite really fierce opposition, and we'll touch on some of that in a minute. But the conversion efforts under PACT have already been underway. And so over 50,000 units of public housing have already been converted under this process. And for many of the residents and communities that have been converted, we've been seeing really troubling signs for resident living conditions coming out of that, which are, in many cases, really heightened eviction rates now that there are private management companies that are in charge of these communities. In many cases, these private management companies are already, in many cases, seen as slumlords that already exist in the private housing market that are now being rewarded through these public contracts in order to get new foothold into public housing. And while some repairs have been done as a part of this program, especially as more time comes out, we've been seeing that many of those repairs were done quite quickly, quite shoddily, and have also begun to fail, with very few options for residents to hold the new management companies accountable. So this provides a real range of issues for housing organizers, residents, and activists to both object to the current conditions that folks are living under, and also think about what this does for the larger future of public housing as an institution as well. Yeah.
I just want to put some emphasis on what you said in terms of high eviction rates, because it ties to what Aitza and I were talking about in terms of the 964 rules and regulations. Those 964 rules and regulations are unique to public housing residents, and it also provides another layer against eviction and or against high eviction rates. Under Section 9, right, a resident is entitled to a hearing before they even are sent to court, right? And so through that hearing, there's extra tools and mechanisms put in place to help a resident stay in that apartment. And when we convert over, that layer disappears. And that's why we saw high eviction rates at the first RAD conversion or PAC conversion here in New York at Ocean Bay Houses.
Absolutely, absolutely, Marquise. And so I think, as you've highlighted as well, thinking about the specific rules and regulations under 964 that give residents not only protections, but also assurances and guarantees for forms of resident organizing, right? As both you and Aitza have also mentioned. And so that's another thing that I want to bring up to this panel, which is this idea of resident engagement at NYCHA and for public housing residents. And so resident engagement, in sort of quotes, has been a specific effort that NYCHA has engaged under, especially in more recent years. We heard Aitza mentioning the Bloomberg administration and how there is very little inclusion of residents. In that time frame, NYCHA has done at least a surface level better job of reaching residents, informing folks of these plans, but in many ways, they're still falling short for what we would consider true resident engagement. So I want to hear from everyone, but I also definitely want to direct part of this question to Aitza, and especially her experience as a TA leader and TA president for over a decade in Smith Houses. Can you speak to the way that NYCHA has performed what it calls resident engagement, or to the role of officially recognized resident representation, like tenant associations, like the citywide council of presidents? How much are residents actually being engaged in these processes?
That's a great question. Today I was in a meeting. As you know, I'm a CCOP member. We sat for 2 hours to have that same conversation of how we are really not included. NYCHA in the last couple of years, what they do is they present to us what they think should be done in our developments or in NYCHA as a whole, but they don't ask us from conception. They don't require, or they don't feel they're required to be, that we should be part of the process, right? And so conception means this, and I'm going to give you a real example of real resident engagement. We were fortunate enough to get money, and unfortunate because some of the money was FEMA money, but we got money from the state assembly, and the money was combined, and we took a park, we set up a committee, and children were part of that committee, right? And we had the principal and teachers from the school, we had community people in the committee, and we designed this park from scratch, and we took the development and management was included. And the park is one of the best parks in the city. In fact, it got an award for recognition. That is true resident engagement. I mean, the colors in the park, the rides in the park were picked by the children, the materials, everything was picked by this committee of people who live there. And it was from conception. And, you know, and I kept on reminding NYCHA and the state, it was the residents who lobbied for the money, right? We lobbied for the money and we got it. And I'm using this as a simple example of resident engagement. But the reality of it is that the same way we built the park, we can fix our apartments. These are all the things we can do if we're at the table when we can. Right now, and I'm gonna try not to get emotional, we have been complaining for the last 5 years that Smith Houses is the only development that sits on ground zero. And nothing was ever done that should have been done for the protections of the residents. With our administration, and I'm talking about the resident association under my leadership, right? The executive board and myself, we've lobbied for money too. So we've gotten all our roofs fixed. There's a lot of things that we've had, but at the same time, we've had contractors come in, especially the people that came in for the FEMA and didn't follow the contract. And so what did they do? They disturbed all that 9/11. And so since then, 5 years ago, and that's when the alarms went up for us, 4 women, just happened to be women, came up to the TA room, says, I've been diagnosed with 9/11 cancer. Since then, we've lost a board member. I've been notified today, I have another resident who's worked on one of the committees who's on a respirator right now. And so because nobody listened to us and because we have not been part of the process in the design or how contractors were chosen or the work, how they were going to do the work, right? We now have the toll, and we're not going to talk about the pandemic and how this administration handled it, but the toll is very high. And so this is when we talk about we're supposed to be at the table from conception. Had they listened to us when we said we have issues, you need to cover the grounds, you need to do this, this wasn't done, maybe some people will be here to be in this room with me to listen to what we had to say. And so that's what we talk about resident engagement, that we're supposed to be part of the process, but the reality of it is that NYCHA does not listen to us. They think, and starting with Joyce Sinderbach, who said it publicly that her biggest problem was the residents in public housing because we were not sophisticated enough to understand the issues or the problems. And this is the mentality that we're dealing with in the NYCHA administration.
Thanks so much, Aitza. I have so much I want to respond to, but I'm wondering if Marquise or Joshua want to add on to this, either some of Aitza's remarks or the larger idea of resident engagement, and perhaps even for Joshua, if you want to tackle part of this, though we'll get to this too, thinking about the engagement of NYCHA employees and workers too as well. But do other folks want to jump in there?
I don't know if Marquise wanted to say anything on this. I mean, what Aisha, I'll be quick. I mean, what Aisha said about designing that park is really, not only at home, kind of ripped my guts out, just because, you know, putting on my architect hat, you know, NYCHA likes to have a very pro forma approach to reaching out to the workers, to the staff, and especially to the residents. Whenever I'm on a design project, you know, we do meet with the resident association president at the beginning and the end, but there's no real engagement with the people who live there. There's no real assessment of what their needs are, their opinions, their tastes. No one, NYCHA never goes back once the project is complete and say, well, what worked, what didn't? You know, what do you think? You know, how can we improve this for the future? You know, I mean, architects tend to suck at that in general, but you think that NYCHA might be a little better being a public agency, but it's really not, you know. And, you know, I think that in addition to resident engagement, I think the one way they get to bypass that is they've always done this, but especially now with PACT and the trust, they're really playing off people's desperation. I think, you know, the fact that it's been so underfunded for so long, and there, as Aisha and Marquise know better than I do, there are so many problems that, you know, people are desperate just to live in a habitable home, you know, and so, you know, they'll go through the pro forma process because, you know, if you're living in a place where you have to use your oven to heat your house, you know, you want that place repaired, you know, and so they're really just, you know, trying to bypass, get people to not see the long-term consequences for the sake of having the repairs done, which are direly needed. But I think they're really playing a game like that. And, you know, and I really, you know, I just want to, you know, even in terms of when we design a project, reaching out to the maintenance staff who maintains the developments and the residency, you know, what, again, you know, what works, what doesn't, what would you like to see happen? How can we make your job easier? NYCHA is so silent, they never bring in those stakeholders either. You know, so it's really a very top-down approach to so-called providing services.
Absolutely. Marquise, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I mean, Aitza is being humble. I mean, she gave a perfect example of what a true resident engagement is, but it's also an example of how we simply can't just listen to what it is that the housing authority tells us. We have to step up and we have to own those rights and those protections, and we have to take full control over those rights and protections. The housing authority will try at every stage, at every setting, to run past the residents to do exactly what they want to do. And it's through tenant association presidents like Aitza, like Priscilla Jameson in the Bronx, like Cynthia Tibbs in Upper Manhattan, like Kiko in Staten Island. All of these tenant association presidents have been living in public housing for decades, and they display how much of an expert they are. But most importantly, they recognize that whatever decision gets made, they and the residents they represent have to live with those decisions. And that's why they take it upon themselves to be bold and to say, we are not going to allow you to do this. We are going to dictate what is happening. And that was the impetus behind starting the Residents to Preserve Public Housing, right, which is a completely resident-led group who come together and say, you know what, we're not going to allow you to just throw this plan on us. We are going to organize, we are going to lobby our legislators, and we are going to push to make sure that these programs do not get implemented. When it comes to the Public Housing Preservation Trust, they introduced that legislation in 2018 or 2019. And it was the tenant association leaders from all across the city who read this program and was like, absolutely not. This is going to be problematic for us for a number of reasons. And they said, we need to organize to do something about it. And for 3 years, we organized and we lobbied and we blocked this legislation from moving forward. When they first introduced the Public Housing Preservation Trust, they wanted to transition 110,000 of NYCHA's 176,000 units into the trust. And we said, absolutely not. In the end, the legislation allowed them to move forward with 25,000. We wanted to make sure that residents had strong decision-making authority in how public housing is ran, not the trust. And in response, they decided, well, what if we allow the residents to vote for the trust? We said we did not want to be vulnerable. We did not want to allow the housing authority to take on all this private debt. And in response, they decided to put a cap on how much money the Public Housing Preservation Trust can borrow. Now, it's sad that they have moved forward with this Public Housing Preservation Trust legislation, but had it not been for tenant association leaders like Aitza, like Priscilla Jameson, like all the other residents across the city, this legislation would have been much worse. And while we are still not happy, we are still fighting to make sure that we get rid of this legislation or make it even weaker than what it is, because it's not about making the public housing preservation more stronger. It's about recognizing how public housing works when we get the resources that we need.
I mean, that's so well said, Marquise. And there's a few things that I really want to highlight there, which is one of them, the ways that one, as I think all of us have tried to highlight going forward, when we think about these programs together, they represent an all-out effort to privatize public housing and to essentially erode or get rid of Section 9 true public housing as we know it. And so as you just mentioned, Marquise, the trust legislation initially wanted to transfer over 100,000 units of public housing into this trust, which would take it out of Section 9 and also allow it to take on private debt. The PACT program is aiming to convert up to 60,000 units. And together that makes almost the entirety of 175,000 units or so that make up what public housing is in New York City today. So these two programs in tandem without resident opposition really were planning to essentially end public housing as we know it in New York City. So the consequences range from the really day-to-day material conditions for residents, but also the longstanding future of public housing as an institution, as a form of the public sector. As Joshua mentioned earlier, this isn't new. It's not new in terms of housing. We've seen privatization efforts in many different public sectors, whether it's education or transportation, but it's also not even new in housing, right? And so the other cities that we alluded to, be they Chicago, San Francisco, Baltimore, have gone through similar and in some cases more extreme forms of this type of legislation through what folks may be familiar with as Hope 6. That essentially demolished these public housing units. And so in New York City, I think there has been resistance from the New York City Housing Authority to go in that direction. But I think residents on the ground are, and as Aitza is a really good example of, are really savvy enough to understand the writing on the wall about where this is going if private developers are allowed to take really deep stakeholds into what public housing is. And the last thing before I segue back to some more questions is that the way that resident engagement also gets weaponized by the New York City Housing Authority. As you mentioned, Marquise, RPPH and many other city groups that have been organizing around privatization in public housing have really put the brakes on the speed and the scale at which many of these plans were initially proposed. And one of the ways that that trust legislation was able to finally pass this summer was by implementing this resident vote provision where nothing will be changed until there's a vote at a specific community. And so again, on the surface level, that seems like, well, that's fair. You can give residents a vote. If they don't vote for it, it won't happen. But as Joshua spoke to earlier, when the status quo is not getting invested in from NYCHA, we're not seeing any improvement from public budgets in NYCHA on the whole. If we're not seeing residents' basic living conditions met, now it becomes very coercive to allow folks a option that is promised to have repairs and maintenance issues or stay with the status quo that provides nothing. And so, Marquise, you mentioned already some of your experience working through this grassroots resident-led formation, Residents to Preserve Public Housing. So I'm wondering if you can briefly also tell us a little bit of what were the strengths of working in this approach, or what are some of the challenges in doing so, and maybe also how you see that in the broader public housing movement outside of this organization.
Grassroots community-based organizations are powerful, but what made the Residents to Preserve Public Housing powerful, a powerhouse, was that we were able to bring tenant associations and resident leaders from all across the city to come together and strategize and organize in a way that hasn't been quite successful in quite a long time. With the model that we put together, we truly put the tenant associations at the forefront and came to them and say, okay, how can we help you? How can we support you? How can we set up a structure that keeps you driving the work that we do? And in doing so, and mind you, we were fighting this fight throughout the pandemic, right? Public housing was hit with this program when we got hit with COVID. And as public housing residents, we were hit twice as hard with COVID because the repair issues exacerbated the spread of COVID within public housing. And so it didn't stop us, even though many of our residents were dying because of what was going on. And instead of providing the necessary resources that were needed, tenant associations had to step up and do this work. And so we were able to get on Zoom every single Sunday and bring these tenant associations together, not just to strategize on how to stop this public housing preservation trust from moving forward, but creating a space where tenant associations and resident leaders can educate one another about what they are doing in their development, what resources they are able to tap into. And even more importantly, we were able to bring decision makers to the table and have the tenant association leaders, the residents, talk directly to those decision makers and be clear on the demands of what they expect of those elected officials. Case in point, Senator Brian Kavanaugh was the senator who introduced the Public Housing Preservation Trust on the state level. And he happened to be my senator. He happened to be Aitza State Senator. And the Lower East Side, as you said, is a force to be reckoned with. But we also had a relationship with Senator Brian Kavanaugh. We said, Brian, we know that you introduced this legislation and we are disappointed that you introduced this legislation without the support or even talking to the residents in your own district. We need you to come on and answer the questions of the residents at the Residents to Preserve Public Housing weekly meeting. And he decided to take us up on his offer. I don't know if that was a good idea for him or not, but it was a powerful move to have him come on and hear from more than 100 public housing residents from across the city say that this plan is a problem and that residents have not had the opportunity to fully understand what was being proposed by the plan, to understand, to have a pipeline to introduce new ideas that would take the place of the Public Housing Preservation Trust. And it was after hearing a slew of residents from all across the city that he decided, you know what, I am not going to move this legislation any further. And that was one of the most powerful days in RPPH's history, to talk to the leaders, the decision makers, and get the decision makers to finally listen to the residents.
Absolutely, Marquise. And I think that one of the ironies of this moment is that even though, as we've been describing, we are under really, really deep attack from these privatization efforts, it's also a moment of some of the strongest tenant and public housing resident organizing that I've seen in very many years, right? And so I think Residents to Preserve Public Housing is a really good example of that. But there are groups citywide that are doing this work, and many of which that we work in coalition with, like Save Section 9, like SECA, the Committee for Independent Community Action, and groups literally across the 5 boroughs that are united in this front, even if they're struggling on different levels of either the state, the city, or the federal, but have really been a united voice. And despite all the issues that NYCHA residents live with, are actually trying to restore value and restore specific actual budget investment into these programs, because these residents, I think, know and understand that this model of housing actually can work, and it's been made not to work as we look at this history of long disinvestment that has really crippled the maintenance issues and the repair issues of the housing authority, right? And I think I heard Joshua alluding to some of those questions as well. So as we get to some of our final pieces here before we move into question and answer with the audience, I want to direct a question to Joshua and really think about, could you speak a little bit more to either the role or the perspective of NYCHA workers, union members, or even architects in particular in the context of these privatization reforms, how these plans have included or impacted NYCHA workers, or even more broadly, the connections that you see that are available between the housing movement and the labor movement?
No, it's a really, really vital question. I would pick up on something that I think Marquise alluded to, is that, it's the cliche, you follow the money, right? And all of this is based on the given, supposedly, that they're going to PAC and they're going to the trust because there is no alternative, right? What else are you going to do when, in fact, if they have $600 million for Buffalo Bills Stadium, if you look at Yankee Stadium and Citi Field, they were basically funded on our dime. All of the luxury developments going up downtown that have tax subsidies, and tax breaks. Of course, and never mind the military budget. I mean, of course, the money is there. We're living at a time now where we want to defend public housing, but we need a lot more of it, right? We're dealing with a national housing crisis. All the people who are rent burdened, out both inside and outside of public housing. So, the labor movement, I wish I could say that there was a united labor movement in support of this, but unfortunately, labor is kind of divided. When they announced the Public Housing Trust, the Teamsters leadership, who represents about 75% of the union workers at NYCHA, was on the podium, backing the trust, and they backed RAD, because they said it means jobs. And, that's the role of the unions, to protect jobs. But again, on the other hand, there are a lot of unions around the country who are starting to do something called bargaining for the common good, where, they are trying to make things like how it's the Chicago teachers who set the high watermark, are actually making affordable housing, not just them, but for their students, a contract demand, trying to connect the dots, saying it's not just about the wallet issues. We're all in this together. But specifically at NYCHA, like I said, when I started at NYCHA in 1999, there were about 16,000 workers. There were under 12,000 now. We've lost 25% of the workforce. A lot of that was the maintenance people. I know Marquise and Aisha people know the impact that's had on the developments themselves. And where I work on my floor, we're literally outnumbered by the consultants now. The only way you can tell you working with consultants by the color of their ID badge. And it's really a tremendous waste. So it's a matter of trying to get people to see that we're in that we have a common interest here, that it's not just us versus them, housing versus labor. And again, you're really trying to stress that the money is there. We're in the middle of contract negotiations now, and of course the city's crying poverty. Adams wants to cut back on the city workforce. We're already tight. So it's a matter of seeing past that, living in a time of huge income disparity as we are. Corporate profits are at a record high, Wall Street is at a record high, but corporate taxes are at a record low. So it's not like the money isn't there, but the political will isn't there. There are some people like Alexa Aviles on the city council, who's a real advocate. Nydia Velasquez, AOC has, the Green New Deal for public housing, which is a national bill. Ilhan Omar has an omnibus housing bill, but they're the exceptions, And so I think it really is, as Marquise said, building a grassroots movement to try and get that pressure and making sure that labor is at the table. I think it was several years ago, came out that in DC 37, my union, there were 300 members who were homeless. These were full-time union members who couldn't afford the rent in the city and couldn't get on the waiting list for public housing. As you said, there's 250,000 people. So, it's a boulder to push uphill, but once people do see that the money is there and there's a unified movement to be made, and we can work with the residents and need to work with the residents, and architects also, I think, are starting, to get past, just design whatever's on the board. We can't, I work with the architectural lobby, and, we're saying we can't just keep on cranking out these towers that are killing the infrastructure, killing the environment, causing gentrification. Central Park is in shadow because of all of these ugly towers that nobody can afford to live in. Even the rich don't, they buy them as investments. They don't even live there half the time. It's just such a pathetic situation. So, there are a lot of dots to be connected. And so long as, again, pushing for the political will to make sure that, the developers don't run this city, which unfortunately, they have too much clout, much too much clout now.
I think that's absolutely right, Joshua. And for me, one of the things I really want to uplift from your commentary is that in many ways, the problem of public housing, and in NYCHA in particular, is one of political will, right? And I think a lot has been made of either funding shortfalls or rents that are collected or the cost of housing in New York City, et cetera. But I think at the end of the day, it really is ultimately a question of political will, and the lack of political will that has existed in this city and in this country for going on decades that has produced what many people see as a failure in this program, when it's one that's actually been, I guess in some ways you could think of sabotaged or internally undermined from the very beginning, just about.
Sorry, one quick point, again,
Yeah.
I'm putting on my architect's hat, is that, there is a culture within NYCHA of just, in terms of design, and we're not talking about housing, we're talking about homes, right? And when we, I love the story, Aisha's story about the park, that's the kind of design you can have if you start out with respect for the people who live there, but so often, it's all stainless steel and concrete, and black and gray paint, and it sends, when they design like that, when it looks like the things you design come out of a prison catalog, it sends a message to people who live in public housing and about people in public housing. It just fuels the whole deterioration process. And I think, we really need to break out of that, because, the renovations that are happening under PAC can't only happen with private money. That's the kind of homes people need, no matter how much rent they pay.
I think that's really right. And the last thing I'll say is that embedded in that comment, embedded in that history of disinvestment, that lower standard of design, and we also heard this from Aitza in terms of the dismissal of public housing residents and their experience, is the legacy of structural racism that has been embedded in public housing from the very, very beginning. Public housing was racially segregated for many decades, as even in New York City in its inception. And when public housing became a primarily residence for Black folks and people of color, is also when funding was systematically decreased in Section 9 public housing. And then we see this movement towards Section 8, which, as we've mentioned before, may provide housing for some folks, but will also do so through centering and enriching private developers and using still housing as a commodity. And so with that, the very last thing that I want to pose before moving into some audience questions and joining in another panelist for us is that, as we've been talking, I think we've highlighted the real critical importance of having a organizing movement, a resident-led housing, public housing movement. But I really want to foreground for folks on the call tonight that public housing and the struggle for public housing is actually not just for public housing residents. It is a struggle that really affects everybody in New York City, and especially folks that are dealing with the housing crisis. And so whether you're a renter, whether you're an owner, whether you're someone who is seeing or experiencing the massive crisis around our unhoused community members in New York City, the massive failure of the state to address these massive housing dislocations. As we mentioned before, and as we've heard from our panelists, public housing, truly public housing, in many ways is one of the only ways to address the housing crisis and to provide true affordable housing in New York City. So even if you're not a NYCHA tenant, even if you're not part of a public housing community, this is a really, really vital struggle for the present and the future of who gets to live in New York City and under what conditions. So with that said, I want to welcome and spotlight another discussant for us. Sorry, Marquise.
Sorry, I just tried to chime in real quick.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I just wanted to do a footnote on the Preservation Trust, and that NYCHA has till October 17th to set up the process of which they're going to hold the elections. It was today that we received a draft copy of their plan. It is, what is today's date? And I say this just to show you the lack of respect and the lack of resident engagement that they are doing in terms of this election. And so that's supposed to happen in each development. And so what I'm saying this because there is no resident engagement if they say there is, and that we need to stop this election process because there really has not been any resident engagement. If I'm the decomp leader and I now have to disseminate that to the board and then to all the other developments by next Monday, do you really think that's resident engagement? And I'll leave it with that. But I thought it was important to let the audience know of how the Preservation Trust is really being ran and what NYCHA calls resident engagement and what we call resident engagement.
And Said's point, this is a very current and still ongoing struggle. And so to that, I wanna spotlight another discussant for us tonight, Jasmine Sanchez, who is another public housing organizer, activist, and also an SLU student that I really want to welcome onto our panel. Welcome, Jasmine. And before we jump into the audience questions, I really want to ask and give you the opportunity to share a little bit about what your experience has been as a public housing activist, as a resident, and some of the specific campaign work that you've been involved in around addressing issues in public housing.
Perfect. Thank you so much, James. Good evening, everyone. As James mentioned, my name is Jasmine Sanchez, and I'm a resident of the New York City Housing Authority, Baruch Houses, which is home to close to 10,000 New Yorkers. My family was the first family in this apartment and one of the first families in the development. I'm also a reclaimed NYCHA fellow for Movement School and a former NYCHA field lead for Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. To answer your question, James, what brought me into this space of organizing, it would have to be, I apologize for the background. Let me just turn my video off really quickly. What brought me into this space was the fact that I had unattended repairs in my development and apartment. It's something that we hear across the board, right? When we're speaking to public housing residents. However, I just wanted to highlight that I recall a time when we didn't have to fight our development or our management or the landlord to get our repairs because NYCHA was pretty good looking back in the 80s and the 70s, you know, even until like the early 90s, I would have to say. I have very fond memories of being there without any repairs in my apartment. But what we did begin to see is the divestment in the 70s under Nixon and then in the 80s under Reagan. And once we started seeing that, we saw that the HUD budget was cut by 50%. And oh, you guys want me to start my video? Okay. And basically what happened was you started to see the need for our repairs, right? Because there was a lack of investment in our communities and in our developments. With that said, I started seeing the repairs in my apartment, specifically the massive water damages that till this day, my unit still has, but I felt, you know, super powerful when I decided to take NYCHA to court myself. They were taking me to court for not paying my rent because of the lack of repairs. And when I got there, they were like, you know that you can file an HP action. And for those of you who don't know what an HP action is, it's an order to show cause directing the correction of violations, right? So we wanted to make sure that, you know, people know that because you can file these, but how successful this was, that I had everything documented. I took NYCHA to court and I won. They had to give me a rent abatement. They had to pay for all my damaged furnitures, every single thing. And for me, that was powerful to know that someone who doesn't come from like a an organizing background, or, coming from a space of like law, right, that I have to know these policies, can actually take, NYCHA to court and be successful. And then I started to work with my neighbors in the same way, and we all started taking them to court, right? Because we figured if one of us could do it, we all could do this, right? And it's that sort of empowerment and inclusion that we always say that we got us. Like, people come and go into our communities. Elected officials come and go because they get turned out, they get voted out. But the people that remain in public housing are the same people that you see on this call. This is our home. We don't plan to leave this community. We've built our social networks there. We have our support systems. Everything is in public housing for us. And for me, it was something that, ignited this like fire in my belly to see that this was something that I could do, and how I can, help others to do this. Really made me want to like continue to do this organizing work in the space, and work with other residents and resident leaders, and the groups that are doing this work on the ground, so that we shouldn't be working in silos, and we have to do this together, because that's how they get us, right? So if we're doing this together, then they know that we're mobilizing a block. And for those of you who don't know, public housing, if it was its own entity, it would be a city. So we have the power to change the face of all things, politics, community issues, everything, if we're just mobilizing ourselves to go out and participate in some of these processes, right? Which are a lot, right? But we have to do this because we hold the power. We truly do. I believe that wholeheartedly, just like everyone else on this panel, they believe that wholeheartedly. So that was like what kind of, got me there, was that personal experience. So yeah.
Thanks so much, Jasmine. I mean, that's really powerful, and I certainly agree. Jasmine, another Lower East Sider, just saying. Even NYCHA likes to sometimes refer to public housing and NYCHA as a city within a city. If you just looked at population, NYCHA residents would outnumber cities like Miami, and I think places like Cleveland, et cetera. But sometimes I like to think of it as the city under the city, right? Like, there's a way that NYCHA is holding up, and public housing residents are holding up the city, but are also feeling the pressure of the rest of the city on top of it, right? So I think for this portion, I really want to move to some audience questions. And also, Jasmine, if you have questions for the panelists as well, I'm happy to think about what questions you can pose for us too. But I want to turn to an audience question, because we do have a really nice number of them coming in. So thanks, folks, for being engaged. I'm going to read this question here from Elizabeth Johnson, who's asking, what do you guys think could improve public housing? What is your opinion on Eric Adams and what he has done to improve these conditions in public housing?
Ooh, they're trying to start a fight. I'll be honest and really transparent. I mean, it was disappointing to see some of the action that our current mayor has taken. As I mentioned earlier, right, what we do is we bring elected officials and candidates to the table so that residents can talk to them directly. And we had candidate Eric Adams on our Sunday meeting to talk about what it is that residents want to see. And of course, he came on, he listened, and he said, well, I'm going to do whatever it is that the residents want us to do to preserve and protect public housing. And so as we were fighting to stop this legislation from moving forward and to push for more city funding, right? Because the best way to stop all of these programs is to make sure that all three levels of government funds public housing. And so as we were knee deep in the city budgeting process and the state budgeting process, we organized a rally on the steps of City Hall to demand funding from the city for public housing. And on the same day, at the same exact time, our mayor decided to hold a counter rally and press conference to push for the Public Housing Preservation Trust. What's more insulting is his actions with the city's budget. When we went there to ask for funding for public housing. Now, it's important to understand when we talk about the PAC program, the Permanent Affordability Commitment Together, the reasoning, right, or the argument for why we need to hand it over to the private sector mostly was around the private sector would be able to utilize and leverage their power to bring in more dollars. But instead, our mayor decided to take $1.2 billion and put it into the PAC program, a program that was supposed to generate its own funding instead of giving it to Section 9 public housing. So another example of how the mayor was beholden to the developers in the city and not responding to the needs and the demands of public housing residents across the city.
I'm right with you, Marquise. Aitza.
To continue the conversation, I have been in a campaign for like the last 2 years that I want to be the chairperson of NYCHA in the middle of the pandemic, because my anger was so huge about how NYCHA was being run by somebody who doesn't even live in the state of New York, making almost $500,000 and making decisions for us. And meanwhile, our residents are dying. I asked the then candidate, Adams, that I wanted to be the chairperson, and his response to me was to laugh in my face. And no, I did not vote for him in the primary. I voted for Paperwood because the laugh in my face was not to me, it was to every resident that I represent. And he thought it was a joke. But what I do know is to the response of how do we fix NYCHA? When NYCHA was run by residents, for residents, it functioned. It had billions of dollars in the reserve, not in the black, not in the red, and it functioned quite well. And so I know that if residents are put in a position where they will run NYCHA, and let's talk about resident management because I saw some of the questions, I know that we can run. And if anything, the pandemic taught us that, because it was the resident leaders and the residents in public housing who took care of the residents by contacting whoever they needed to get PPE, to get vaccinations, to get whatever they needed for their residents to stay alive. And so we know in this decade, we know in the last 3 years, if nothing else, that yes, we can run our developments. Yes, we know how to do it. And we have the capacity to do it. And so, yes. And my only anger right now when it comes to all of this is the energy that we have spent trying to stop the preservation could have been spent in Washington, D.C., making all those senators from Virginia and every other state that voted no to give us our $40 billion for our infrastructure. And that we should have been able to go there and as American citizens, as taxpayers, even though the president that was sitting there never paid $1 in tax in the last, I don't know how many years, and demand, not even ask, demand that they vote and they vote to give us money because it is our right as citizens. That's what should have happened.
I agree a lot with that, Aitza, and I want to turn to Joshua if he has anything to add on this question, but I'll just chime in and say, like, in terms of what can be done to improve things in NYCHA, as we've heard, there's clearly a lack and a need for more funds, but I think it doesn't stop and end there, right? And so as we've been hearing from Aitza, from Marquise, from Joshua, what's really needed, and I think this maybe addresses a few of the other questions that came up in the panel as well, in terms of this political climate where residents aren't able to hold NYCHA or elected officials accountable. What we need is true resident leadership, true resident empowerment, true resident collective autonomy and decision-making power in public housing communities, because residents are the folks that are on the front line, and they're the ones that deal with the fallout of having mismanagement, of not having a properly funded housing authority. And as we've heard from Aitza and other folks, this is quite literally actually matters of life and death. And for administrators, for bureaucrats, for many times elected officials, these are questions that can be politicized and kind of kicked down the road. Whereas for residents, this is literally a life and death issue. And so putting residents into real leadership position in the housing authority in terms of budget, in terms of policy direction, in terms of design, in terms of future planning, I think is really, really critical, and it's really, really needed. Yeah, Joshua, I'm not sure if you have anything to add to that.
Not much. I would, if Aisha was head of NYCHA, that would make her my boss, but now, having been in NYCHA 22 years, we got nowhere to go but up, but also, no, having the people who live there, who do know the issues, really run things, would be such an improvement. Like you said, there's no substitute for making up the shortfall in the 40 years of disinvestment that Jasmine touched on. But NYCHA always makes the worst of a bad situation. There's no transparency. I think accountability is absolutely the key word. I've been to so many city council hearings where we spoke against privatization, outsourcing, and mismanagement, and the city council people will just eviscerate NYCHA's dog and pony show, and it's fun to watch, but there's no real teeth behind it. They're not really held accountable. I was like, the MTA was having 2 sets of books. NYCHA doesn't even have, they have 1 set of books they don't show anybody. But, so we've been talking about having a forensic audit for so long. The last time we went to a budget hearing, and it's, well, how much do you spend on accountants? We'll have to get back to you on that. How many contracts are outsourced? We'll have to get back to you on that. How much money are you spending on Section 3? We'll have to get back to you on that. And they're shameless. You can't shame these people. When Greg Russ came before the city council and they said, you are sitting on 94% of city capital funding. What's going on? He said, well, we got to do better. It's like, oh, well, duh, but how? It's like, so, and the state also really needs to step up, because it's a state mandated authority, but Albany has been missing in action for as long as anybody can remember. So I think that, again, so it is that, kind of, we need the money, but also just one last point is that, people starting to say, why should we give you more money when you can't even manage the money you have now? So their mismanagement is having a really bad effect on maintaining or expanding public housing. So I think really holding them accountable and having a level of transparency is something that the workers need and the residents need.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think I see Jasmine has a hand up.
Yeah, I actually wanted to touch base. I've been reading some of the questions, and I know some folks are asking like, what's like an alternative and, things of that nature. And I kind of wanted to jump in really quickly, because while we're focusing on NYCHA, which is in New York, because we're all in New York, public housing is national. And although New York City has the largest, Puerto Rico comes in second with 325. There was a map that I shared. I don't know if you wanted to blast that out later, that shows you where all the public housing stock is in this nation, right? So we're here fighting, right, in New York City, but we're also going to be an example to these smaller public housing developments nationwide, right? So they brought the fight to a really great place, because we are not going to back down, right? And, this is going to be a learning block for like all of us. But I also wanted to say that while this is really exciting, and what we're asking for is, the monies to make the repairs, the Green New Deal for public housing, if no one has, read this bill, it is a bill that was drafted with public residents at the forefront. We were literally in a 12-week session with AOC's team and Sanders' team working on what this bill could look like, integrating everything that we've seen on the ground and what can make our lives better, right? Because public housing was not built for Black and brown people. They were built for the vets that were returning back from war, right? Those are white folks that were coming back, right? So if we're going to talk about it from that lens, we had all of those protections. The Section 3, they were getting their own businesses. That's how they were so quick to leave public housing and go into the suburbs, right? Because they had that investment from the federal government. They had opportunities. And one thing that we want to make sure that everyone knows is that public housing is federal. So when we're talking about how are we combating this, we have to look at not just our city council or our state, but we have to go to the people that own these developments, which is our federal government. And it's really exciting because they have the power to transform our public housing and to expand it, right? The Green New Deal for Public Housing Bill, it invests not only in the infrastructure, which I think that it's important, but this one has something completely different, that they actually invest in frontline communities, making it about us. Like they're investing in us. They're ensuring that they're there's teeth and meat to Section 3, where you can't just say, I posted a flyer. We want to make sure that our residents know about this and what did you do to get them, this opportunity, right? It's a resident council nationwide. It is no longer just like the C cops, like of all the developments, right? There's an implementing a resident council nationwide that approves any contract that is coming in. This bill pushes for contracts to be given to public housing residents, right? Like if you have your licenses to do this work, we have tons of talent from carpenters, painters, people that do construction work that live in NYCHA. They should have the first opportunity to get these contracts, right? So if you haven't read this bill, it's not only about the bones of public housing, but it's the investment in the people that live here. As I mentioned before, we're not going anywhere. So we want those opportunities as well.
I mean that's really excellent, Jasmine. And so I think to your point about the people of public housing, and there are many more questions in the chat. I'm sorry that we didn't have the chance to get to every single one of them, but this next one that I really want to pose is from Laya, I think, Antoinette. How do you get more residents involved in their resident engagement and in tenant associations? How can a resident reach out to get involved? And so for me, this is always a big question, which is, we've been describing our work, we've been describing the context and our organizing experiences, but for folks that are NYCHA residents who are maybe are not NYCHA residents, but are housing organizers, advocates, activists, folks that are looking to get involved in this movement, how do we bring them in, or what's an inroad from each of our perspectives to really grow this movement with the many folks that it affects? You can go ahead, Jasmine.
Yeah, I'm sorry, only because the flyer was just posted like
oh,
a
that's
second
great. Yes,
ago.
yeah, sorry
So
about that.
this is a great question. Any public housing resident that wants to get involved, we're starting to build up the second cohort of Reclaim. So please pass this along to any RAs, any NYCHA resident that's interested. They will be getting a project-based stipend, which is fantastic. After the 12 weeks, they have to do an activity in their development. They get a stipend to do that. So it's not coming out of their pockets, but this is a way that we can start organizing and that everyone is learning the same thing and hearing it from the same folks that are like facilitating this, right? So our goal is not only to partner with Movement School and Sunrise, we're looking to partner with RPPH, right? We want to make sure that Safe Section 9 is in here. So this is the first flyer, the jab at it, but it's really having folks that are on the front lines doing this work, facilitating this throughout the 326 developments in New York City.
Absolutely. Other folks want to jump in, ways that residents or even non-residents can get involved in this larger movement, either in their local TAs or more broadly?
For me, for people who are not in public housing, they can call their elected officials and let them know that they're not happy with them voting for the Preservation Trust. That's how people can help. For residents to get involved, it falls on the leadership and the residents who are volunteers. And sometimes we actually have to do a lot of door knocking to let people know that this is a real reality. My experience lately has been that residents, because NYCHA is sending all the stuff out and there's an issue of trust, will come and ask, and then we explain to them that it's not as pretty as they say. I can tell you that in my general meeting, I told the residents, we don't want new stoves, we don't want new refrigerators. This is what we need, so this will stop, which is our infrastructure. And people have to understand that. They tell them we'll give, what the problems that we're having with the mold and all of that is that we have pipes that are like 70, 80 years old inside our walls that need to be changed and fixed. And once those are fixed, we will have no problems. And then you can fix your apartment any way you want. But for now, we need infrastructure to be fixed so that we can live decently and have a quality of life, because it's affecting our health, right? And so that's what residents have to understand. And we try, people really try. Some people, I don't know how to say this, they don't believe it. They can't think that people don't care. And I try to tell them that they don't care because they don't live here. They don't live in public housing. They don't even live in the state of New York. So how can they care about what happens to your next door neighbor, right? They don't, and so we have to care for each other, and we have to be our neighbor's keeper, our brother's keeper. And that's how my board and all of us act when we try to help each other and help, the residents in terms of getting things fixed and done.
Absolutely. Marquise, do you have anything you want to add to how residents or folks in general can get involved in resident engagement in NYCHA or in the broader public housing movement?
Absolutely. I mean, AITA runs one of the most engaging tenant associations that I have ever been a part of. And for the residents to preserve public housing, we don't have any funding. We work purely off of volunteerism. And the one thing I tell everyone is you don't have to be a perfect speaker. You don't have to write the perfect press release. Whatever skill you have, whether you are a phenomenal cook, whether you are a phenomenal artist, whether you just know how to organize things, any skill that you have, we welcome it, we embrace it, because all of these skills brought in collectively helps us get to the goals that we need. And what I will say is that leadership matters. When you have a tenant association election coming up at your development, make sure you get out and vote, because these tenant association presidents really do have the power and really do represent your interests when you put the right person in office. And as people who are not in public housing, recognize that if they are successful in eliminating the public housing program throughout the city and throughout this country, your home is next. So work with us to save public housing, because the public housing model works when we have the resources that we need. No one should be paying more than 30% of their income on housing, right? And we need to get that 30% even lower. But let's start at the model and let's spread that model across all housing sectors so that we truly have the ability to thrive in our city and take full control of our city and have self-determination on the future of our cities.
Well said, Marquise. Well said. Joshua, any last thoughts on how folks can get involved in the public housing movement?
I mean, well, really quick. I mean, you should come to an RPPH meeting, because I mean, the organizing they do is just, I'm in awe. The meeting when Marquise with Brian Kavanaugh faced the fire for more than 2 hours. I mean, my union leadership can meet with him, but the rank and file never gets a chance to do that kind of thing. It was really amazing to see that time after time. But what I would say is that it's like you said, it's not just people in public housing. We are facing a national housing crisis as real estate has become such a profitable money-making machine. And I think it's really important that we connect the dots as best we can. There are groups like Housing Justice for All and the Metropolitan Housing Council, and they do really great work trying to have just cause evictions and fighting for more rent control and rent stabilization. But again, it just tends to be on parallel paths. It tends to be siloed. We're fighting for market rate tenants over here, and we're fighting for public housing tenants over here. And I think one group will fight, to stop one more luxury tower to stop gentrification. But everybody needs to support each other's kind of the struggle, because it is, one struggle for housing as a human right. And same thing with the unions, by the way. When San Francisco's public housing was privatized, SEIU, the union who represents the workers in San Francisco, issued probably the only statement against privatizing public housing that I've seen from the union. And it was great that they did that, but it shouldn't be the exception. Because somebody posted in the chat, about a quarter of union members at NYCHA are also NYCHA residents. There's a big overlap. So I think that connecting the dots and breaking down the barriers and seeing it as one struggle. Again, it's easier said than done, let's be honest, but it's absolutely vital. So that's what I would put out there.
I agree. I echo what each of our panelists have said. And I think for me, it's going to start with organizing, with base building, right? With NYCHA residents, but also with neighbors, with folks that are involved in the housing movement, but may not be making the connections to public housing, folks that may be involved in union work or the labor movement, but haven't made those connections with the housing movement, or folks that are out of them altogether and seeing their place in the larger landscape of housing in New York City, and how, again, public housing is in many ways a bedrock that if that crumbles, will become a really, really precarious place for so many of the working class and the renting class in New York City, which is the majority of us. And so this is something I heard Jasmine say earlier, but in many ways, we actually do have so much more power than already has been utilized. And so I think that there's more to come out of this public housing movement and the larger housing movement in general. And so spaces like these, I think, are really excellent ways to bring that conversation and bring that struggle to light in order to continue to move it into the future. So I think we're a little bit over time already. So I really want to thank each of our panelists, Aitza, Marquise, Joshua, and Jasmine, for a really terrific discussion. I really want to thank our audience members for being on the call with us, for all of your engaged questions in the chat. And once again, a huge shout out to SLU and the public engagement team for facilitating and organizing this really, really important conversation. As Michael mentioned up front, we have a few more events coming into October and November, so please stay tuned for that. And I think that's gonna be just about it from me. I see some folks from Goals and the participants, so shout to Goals. I saw Damaris Reyes was on here, so shout to D. Thank you all. I hope y'all have a really terrific evening, and we'll see y'all for the next one.